Whether you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear a voice behind you saying, "This is the way, walk in it." Isaiah 30:21. There is a particular kind of darkness that only believers know. It is not the darkness of someone who never believed. It is not the cold indifference of the secular world, where the absence of God is simply the absence of something never expected. This is a different darkness altogether. It is the darkness of a room where a fire once burned, where the walls still hold the warmth of what used to be, where the smell of the smoke still lingers, where every corner reminds you that the light was real, that it was here, that you did not imagine it. Caleb knew this darkness intimately. He had not always known it. There had been a time, not so long ago that it felt like another lifetime, but long enough that it ached like one, when faith had been the air he breathed. Not a performance, not a habit inherited from his parents and never examined. Real faith, the kind that rises before the alarm goes off, the kind that turns a Tuesday commute into something almost holy, the kind that reads a passage of scripture and feels the words land somewhere deep, below the mind, below the chest, in the place where a person is most truly themselves. He had built his life on that foundation, slowly, carefully, the way a man builds something he intends to last. He had married at 26. Claire was not the woman his younger self had imagined. She was better, stranger, more particular. She laughed at things he did not expect her to laugh at, and grew quiet at things he expected to move her. She was a reader of obscure theological texts and a terrible cook, and she prayed like she was talking to someone in the same room, which sometimes unsettled him, and sometimes made him feel that he was standing on the edge of something vast. They had built a life together in the kind of city where people work too hard and sleep too little, and convinced themselves that busy is the same as alive. They had attended the same church for 11 years. They had led a small group in their living room every other Thursday. They had 2 sons, 8 and 11 years old, who knew the Lord's Prayer by heart, and who still occasionally climbed into their parents' bed in the morning. Caleb had been grateful, genuinely, specifically grateful, not in the vague, performative way of a man who knows he is supposed to be thankful, but in the way of someone who looks at his life and feels the weight of it, the undeserved goodness of it, and whispers something wordless toward heaven. Then the year came. There is no other way to name it, simply the year. The one that arrived like any other and left like a demolition. It began in February with the phone call from his manager. The company was restructuring. His department, 14 people, 12 years of institutional memory, was being dissolved. The word dissolved was used, as though they were not human beings with mortgages and children and identities built around what they did each morning, but rather a substance that could simply be returned to water. He was given a severance package and a handshake and a badge that no longer worked by the time he reached the parking garage. He drove home in a silence that felt geological. Claire was kind. She was patient. She was everything a person is supposed to be when the ground shifts. But somewhere in the months that followed, the months of applications and interviews and rejections and the slow, particular humiliation of being a 41-year-old man who cannot provide the life his family is accustomed to, something changed between them. Not dramatically. No single conversation, no accusation, no explosion. It was quieter than that and therefore more frightening. A series of silences where conversation used to live. A quality of presence that was really a quality of absence. 2 people occupying the same house with increasing courtesy and decreasing intimacy, like neighbors who have learned to wave but no longer remember each other's names. By August, Claire sat down across from him at the kitchen table after the boys had gone to bed, and she said the words that people say when they have rehearsed them so many times that they have gone smooth, like river stones. She said she loved him. She said she did not know how to keep going. She said she had been talking to someone, a counselor, a pastor, a friend, it did not matter, and that she needed space to understand what she felt. She said she was not asking for a divorce, only for time. He had nodded. He had not cried. He had not been capable of crying because somewhere beneath the surface a deeper numbness had already taken hold, the way a limb goes cold before it goes entirely still. The boys went with Claire to her mother's house in Ohio. The apartment felt in their absence like a location rather than a home, a place with furniture and a zip code. He moved through it the way a person moves through a hotel room, using the surfaces without belonging to them. And then, slowly, without fanfare, God went quiet. This was the worst of it. Not the job, not the marriage, not the particular grief of watching his younger son's face through the car window as Claire drove away. A face that was trying to be brave in the way children try to be brave when they sense that bravery is being asked of them. All of that was terrible. All of that would have been enough to bring a man to his knees. But the silence of God was something else entirely. Caleb had prayed his whole adult life. He had prayed in the morning and in the evening and in the middle of the night when the world was still, and the prayers rose like breath in cold air. He had heard over the years, not audibly, never audibly, but in the other way, the way that cannot be easily explained to someone who has not experienced it, something in return, a weight that lifted, a direction that clarified, a peace that arrived without logical cause and settled into the chest like a hand placed gently on a shoulder. Now there was nothing. He prayed and the words went up and nothing came back. He opened his Bible and the verses, which had once felt like they were arranged specifically for him, which had always seemed to carry a secondary meaning beneath the historical one, a meaning that was personal and immediate, now felt like ink on paper, ancient, remote, like reading the correspondence of people he had never met. He went to church on 3 consecutive Sundays and sat in the back and felt for the first time in his adult life like a man watching a ceremony he did not understand. The worship songs that had once moved him now felt like a language he had spoken fluently and was suddenly losing. He watched the people around him with their closed eyes and raised hands, and he felt something that took him a long time to name. Not envy exactly, something lonelier than envy. The feeling of a man standing outside a lit window looking in. On the 4th Sunday he did not go. He sat instead in the apartment that was not a home, in the silence that was not peace, and he thought the thought that he had been circling for weeks, the thought that arrives eventually in every dark night of the soul, the one that every believer fears and every honest believer eventually thinks. He thought, what if I built everything on something that was not there? What if the warmth he had felt all those years was the warmth of community, of habit, of a mind trained to find patterns and call them providence? What if the peace had been neurological, a brain chemistry that favored calm in the presence of ritual? What if God was simply the name he had given to his own longing, the way a child names a shadow on the wall to make it less frightening? He sat with the thought until it had nowhere left to go. And then he did something he could not have explained. He got his coat. He drove without planning, without direction, until the city thinned and the lights grew sparse, and the road became something that cut through open land. He drove until he found a place where the sky was visible in all directions. He pulled over. He got out of the car into air that was cold and clean and indifferent, the kind of air that the desert makes, that the plains make, that asks nothing of you and therefore gives you room to be exactly what you are. He stood under the stars and he said out loud into the enormous and apparently empty night, I don't know how to do this anymore. No thunder, no voice from a whirlwind, no sudden warmth in the chest, no peace that passed understanding. Only the wind and the darkness and the stars, which were, if nothing else, real. Undeniably, verifiably, almost violently real. He looked at them for a long time, longer than he had stood outside looking at anything in years. Something began to shift, not dramatically, not like a curtain lifted or a lock turned, more like the way your eyes adjust in a dark room. The darkness does not diminish, but slowly, incrementally, without announcement, shapes begin to emerge that were there all along. He thought about Caleb in the book of Numbers, his namesake, the one who had surveyed the promised land alongside 10 others and come back with a different report. 10 men said, The giants are too large. One man said, "The God who brought us out of Egypt is larger still." 40 years in the wilderness followed, not because God had abandoned the promise, but because the people could not yet carry what the promise required of them. 40 years of manna, 40 years of the same horizon, 40 years of a God who is present not in the spectacular but in the daily, in the bread that appeared each morning without explanation, in the cloud that moved before the camp and stopped and moved again. He had been looking for a fire. God had been sending manna. He had been listening for a voice that interrupted. God had been speaking in the accumulation, in the fact that his sons called him every evening, in the fact that his best friend from church had shown up at his door 3 weeks ago with takeout and 2 hours and no agenda, in the fact that he had not, in all of this, entirely stopped breathing, entirely stopped hoping, entirely stopped turning, even in his confusion, toward the direction where he had always felt something larger than himself to be. The silence had not been absence. He understood this now, standing under the stars of a country so large it made a human being feel like punctuation. The silence had been invitation. An invitation to stop expecting God to perform and start learning to recognize the way presence moves in the ordinary, the way water moves in a landscape. Not always rushing, not always obvious, but always shaping, always working, always reaching for the lowest place. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost did not look. When he did, it was a text from Claire. It said only, "The boys are praying for you." Then, after a pause, "So am I." He stood very still. The wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of the road with the sound of something breathing. He drove home in the dark, and for the first time in months, the dark did not feel like a verdict. It felt like what it was, a night, the kind that ends. In the weeks that followed, nothing resolved itself with the tidy efficiency of a story that has decided to be a lesson. The job search continued. Claire and the boys were still in Ohio, though the phone calls grew longer, warmer, more willing to say the true things. He went back to church, not because the doubt had vanished, but because he had decided that faith was not the same as certainty, that showing up in the dark was not dishonesty, but something closer to its opposite. He began to read again, not strategically, not searching for the verse that would solve the equation, but slowly, the way you relearn a language you once knew. He read the Psalms, which had always been his least favorite book, too raw, too unguarded, too willing to accuse heaven directly. He had preferred the tidier books, the ones with clear moral architecture. Now the Psalms felt like the only honest thing in his possession, a record of men and women who had stood in the same dark field and said the same unguarded thing into the same indifferent-seeming sky, and had, somehow, found reason to continue. One morning in November, early, before the city had fully assembled itself, he stood at the window of the apartment with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand and watched the light come. It came the way it always comes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but by increments so small they are almost imperceptible. First the darkness softens, then the shapes of things return, then the color cautiously, as though it is not yet sure of its welcome. He did not feel the presence of God in any way he could prove or measure. He did not feel peace in the way that required no effort, in the way he had once taken for granted. What he felt was something smaller and more durable, a willingness, a sense, quiet, unperformative, immune to circumstances, that the voice Isaiah described was not a relic of an ancient promise, but a word still spoken, still moving through the dark behind him, still saying, "This is the way." He turned from the window. He picked up his phone. He called Claire. She answered on the second ring. Nothing was solved in that conversation. Everything was different. There are men who lose everything and find beneath the loss a foundation they did not know they had built. Not a foundation of comfort or of easy answers. Not a foundation that prevents the next storm. A foundation that does not move when the storm arrives. Caleb had spent his whole believing life building something he thought was faith, And now, having watched the structure shake and the certainties peel away, he discovered what had been underneath all along. Not certainty, not the absence of doubt, something older than both. A trust that had survived its own testing. The winter came. The days were short and the light was thin, and the city kept its restless, indifferent pace. He found work in January, not the position he had lost, not the salary, not the title. Something smaller, something that left him for the first time in years with evenings that belonged to no one. He began to write, slowly at first, and then with increasing urgency, the things he had learned in the dark. Not a book, not a sermon. Letters, really. Letters to himself. Letters to the man he had been before the year came. The man who had been grateful but perhaps not yet fully awake to the difference between the gifts and the giver. By spring, Claire came home, not to the same marriage, to a different one, rebuilt from a more honest material. A marriage that had been through the wilderness and come out changed in the way that wilderness changes things. Stripped of what was decorative, left with what was essential. The boys came back to a father they could not fully articulate but somehow sensed was more present than before, more willing to sit with hard questions, less insistent on the performance of certainty. On a Sunday in April, Caleb sat in the third row of the church he had attended for 11 years. His younger son was beside him, leaning against his arm with the particular heaviness of a child who is not quite asleep. The worship leader was singing something he had sung 100 times before. The words were the same. Everything was the same, and nothing was the same. And he understood now that this was not a contradiction, but simply the nature of things seen clearly. He closed his eyes. He breathed. Somewhere in the geography of the chest, in the place below words, below explanation, below the categories and the doubts and the long, careful arguments of a mind that had been working very hard for a very long time, something was quiet. Not empty, not absent. Quiet the way a room is quiet when the one you love has fallen asleep beside you. Quiet the way the ground is quiet before the rain. Quiet with presence, not absence. Quiet with the patience of something that was always there, waiting for the noise to stop so it could be heard. Glory be to the God who speaks in the desert, who sends manna when we ask for maps, who meets the wanderer in the open field and offers not explanation but direction, who writes the path not in fire on the sky but in the accumulation of mornings, in the persistence of those who love us, in the voice that does not shout and does not withdraw, but continues, quietly and without condition, to say, "This is the way, walk in it."